Rome in the year 100 BC was a city of sharp contrasts, raw ambition, and ancient traditions. It was a place where marble temples stood side by side with crowded, wooden tenements, and where the echoes of military triumphs mixed with the daily murmurs of political unrest. Into this turbulent world, a boy was born into the patrician family of the Julii, a lineage that proudly traced its ancestry back to Aulus Julius, the son of Ascanius and the grandson of the Trojan prince Aeneas, thus claiming divine descent from the goddess Venus herself. This boy was named Gaius Julius Caesar. Despite the noble and ancient pedigree of the Julian family, they were not among the wealthiest or most powerful political elites of the late Republic. By the time Caesar entered the world, the Julii had seen better days. They possessed an illustrious name, rich in mythological significance, but their political influence had waned in the generations leading up to Caesar's birth. They were patricians, members of Rome's original ruling class, yet their financial situation was far from secure, and their connections to the active centers of power were strained. Caesar grew up in a household that understood the weight of a glorious heritage, even as it navigated the quiet indignities of diminished political clout. To understand the Rome of Caesar's youth, one must look at the violent forces tearing the Republic apart. Decades of foreign conquest had flooded Italy with wealth, slaves, and immense power, but this bounty was distributed unevenly. A small class of senators grew fabulously rich, buying up vast tracts of land worked by enslaved people, while ordinary Roman citizens, many of them small farmers who had served dutifully in the legions, found themselves dispossessed and impoverished. These veterans and landless citizens drifted into the city of Rome, creating a massive, restless urban underclass that could easily be swayed by clever politicians. This social fracture manifested as a bitter ideological and political division within the Roman Senate. On one side were the optimates, the best men, a conservative faction of aristocrats who believed that supreme power should rest solely in the hands of the Senate and traditional institutions. They sought to protect their ancestral privileges against any populist challenger. On the other side were the populares, politicians who championed the rights of the common people, utilizing the popular assemblies and passing land reforms or grain distributions to build a powerful base of support. Politics in Rome was no longer merely a matter of dignified debate in the Senate House. It was a high-stakes, brutal struggle for supremacy where violence and intimidation became common tools. This atmosphere of civil strife touched Caesar's family directly through marriage and political alignment. Caesar's Aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, a towering figure in Roman history and the champion of the populares. Marius was a self-made military hero who had reformed the Roman legions, opening military service to the poor, and tying the loyalty of soldiers directly to their generals rather than to the state. Marius had risen to unprecedented heights, holding the consulship an astonishing 7 times, and his fiery populism placed him at direct loggerheads with the conservative aristocracy led by Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Growing up in a household closely tied to Marius meant that the young Caesar was exposed to the highest levels of political calculation and danger. He watched as his family navigated the treacherous waters between the ambitious, populist military reform movement of his uncle and the entrenched, defensive hostility of the senatorial elite. Caesar received the traditional elite education expected of a Roman patrician youth. He studied Greek literature, rhetoric, philosophy, and history, learning the arts of persuasion and public speaking that would later become his greatest weapons. Under the guidance of skilled tutors, he mastered the cadence of classical oratory, realizing early on that words could move crowds just as effectively as swords could move armies. Yet, the world outside his home was erupting into open warfare. The social war, a devastating conflict between Rome and its disgruntled Italian allies who demanded full Roman citizenship, shook the peninsula to its core. Even as Rome eventually granted citizenship to its Italian neighbors, the domestic political feud between Marius and Sulla exploded into full-scale civil war within the very heart of the Republic. Sulla, marching his loyal legions directly against the city of Rome, an unprecedented and taboo act that shattered the sacred laws of the Republic, seized control of the capital. Marius and his faction were driven out, hunted, or killed in a brutal purge. Caesar, just a teenager during these harrowing years, absorbed every lesson of this chaotic era. He witnessed firsthand how the ancient institutions of the Republic were bending and breaking under the weight of personal ambition and military might. He saw that political survival required resilience, sharp alliances, and an unflinching readiness to face mortal peril. The Rome of his birth was not a stable, harmonious commonwealth, but an arena of fierce competition where only the most adaptable and daring could hope to endure. The stage was set for a young man of extraordinary intellect, boundless ambition, and an ancient name to step forward into the fray, carrying within him the seeds of a transformed world. The transition from boyhood to manhood in late Republican Rome was marked by the assumption of the toga virilis, the plain white woolen garment that signaled a youth's entry into the adult world of civic and political responsibility. For Gaius Julius Caesar, this rite of passage occurred against a backdrop of mounting terror and shifting fortunes within the capital. His father had died suddenly when Caesar was just a teenager, leaving him as the nominal head of the Julian household, at a time when the family name was a liability. The faction of the Populares, led by his uncle Gaius Marius and his father-in-law Lucius Cornelius Cinna, had dominated the city through radical reforms and street-level intimidation. But the wheel of fortune turned with crushing swiftness. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, returning victorious from the Mithridatic Wars in the East, marched his seasoned legions directly onto the sacred soil of Rome, bathing the streets in the blood of his political enemies through the institutionalized terror of the proscriptions. Sulla emerged as absolute dictator, holding the power of life and death over every citizen in the Republic. He set about systematically dismantling the democratic and populist structures that the Marian faction had erected, executing rivals, stripping offices, and confiscating properties. Young Caesar, closely tied to the condemned regime by blood and marriage, found himself directly in the dictator's crosshairs. Prior to Sulla's ultimate victory, Caesar had been nominated for the prestigious and ancient office of the Flame Diales, the high priest of Jupiter. This sacred position carried immense religious prestige, but it also imposed crippling restrictions upon its holder. The priest was forbidden from touching a horse, sleeping outside his own bed for more than 3 nights, viewing an army, or touching metal. More importantly, the office tied him inextricably to the traditional religious establishment of the city. When Sulla seized absolute power, he looked upon the young patrician with deep suspicion. Recognizing Caesar's kinship with Marius and his marriage to Cornelia, the daughter of the slain populist leader Cinna, Sulla commanded the young man to divorce his wife. It was an order backed by the full weight of a tyrant who had thousands executed without trial. To comply would mean abandoning his honor, betraying his wife, and bowing to a regime built on the slaughter of his relatives. To refuse openly meant immediate execution, public exposure, and the total ruin of his family's remaining estate. Caesar did not bend. with a quiet, unyielding resolve that would become the hallmark of his entire career. He flatly refused to put Cornelia away. Instantly, Sulla stripped him of his priesthood, confiscated Cornelia's dowry, and placed Caesar's name on the fatal lists of the proscribed. Overnight, a 19-year-old patrician nobleman became an outlaw hunted in his own city. Sulla's assassins and bounty hunters scoured the dark alleys of Rome and the surrounding countryside for enemies of the state. Forced to abandon his home, Caesar fled into the rugged hill country of the Sabines under the cover of night, constantly shifting his lodgings to evade capture. During one of these harrowing midnight flights through the rural hills, Caesar fell directly into the hands of a patrol of Sulla's soldiers. Confronted with armed men searching for fugitives, the young man demonstrated the cool, calculating nerve that would later baffle his enemies on the battlefield. He bribed the patrol's commander, a man named Cornelius, with a substantial sum of gold, 2 talents, securing his freedom while the soldiers looked the other way. Realizing that Italy was no longer safe and that Sulla's reach extended across the entire peninsula, Caesar made the bold decision to leave his homeland entirely. He journeyed south to the coast, slipped past port authorities, and set sail across the Mediterranean Sea toward the province of Asia Minor. There, he sought refuge in the court of King Nicomed's Roman IV of Bithynia, immersing himself in diplomatic circles and military logistics. Seeking to prove his worth and rebuild his reputation away from the toxic politics of Rome, Caesar enlisted in the provincial army under the command of Marcus Minucius Thermus. Sent on a dangerous mission to secure a naval fleet from the king, the young exile proved his mettle during the brutal siege of the coastal city of Mytilene. Amid flying arrows and clashing shields, Caesar fought with conspicuous bravery, earning the prestigious civic crown, a wreath of oak leaves awarded to any Roman soldier who saved the life of a fellow citizen in battle. It was a supreme military honor that granted him lifelong status and entry into the Senate's lower ranks upon his eventual return. Yet, his travels across the treacherous waters of the Aegean Sea exposed him to other perils. While sailing near the island of Pharmacusa, Caesar's ship was intercepted and boarded by fierce Cilician pirates who infested the eastern Mediterranean. Taken captive by ruthless sea rovers who treated high-born Romans with casual cruelty, Caesar did not cower. When the pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, Caesar laughed in their faces, famously informing them that they gravely underestimated his worth. He insisted that they demand 50 talents instead, sending his companions ashore to gather the immense sum, while he remained aboard the pirate vessel for nearly 40 days. Far from acting like a terrified prisoner, Caesar treated his captors with haughty amusement, reading them his poetry, composing speeches, and jokingly warning them that he would one day hunt them down and crucify every last one of them, a promise the pirates laughed off as the eccentric bravado of an aristocratic youth. True to his word, the moment his ransom was paid and he was set ashore at Miletus, Caesar organized a naval force, tracked the pirates down to their lair, captured them, and brought them to justice, displaying a ruthless efficiency that stunned the provincial magistrates. Back in Rome, the political climate slowly began to shift. Sulla, having purged his enemies and instituted his sweeping constitutional reforms, abruptly abdicated his dictatorship in 79 BC, retiring to a private estate where he died shortly thereafter. With the tyrant gone, the suffocating atmosphere of fear that had choked the capital began to clear. Friends and powerful relatives in Rome petitioned the Senate on Caesar's behalf, arguing that a young man who had fled as an outlaw had proven his worth through military service abroad and posed no immediate threat to the state. Sulla himself, displaying an eerie flash of political foresight, had reportedly warned his supporters that they should beware of the young man with the loose belt, declaring that there were many Mariuses inside that single boy. Caesar returned to Rome a changed man. The youthful vulnerability of his early teens had been burned away by exile, war, and the constant shadow of death. He returned not as a broken refugee seeking pardon, but as a seasoned, hardened operator who had stared down a dictator, faced pirates, and survived the worst civil war in Roman history. He understood that the old republic was fundamentally broken, that laws, sacred offices, and traditional moral restraints could be swept away overnight by the point of a sword. The experiences of his youth forged a character that would not bend under pressure, teaching him that survival required absolute adaptability, financial daring, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. As he walked once more through the bustling, restless streets of Rome, the young patrician began to lay the groundwork for a political career that would shatter the boundaries of the ancient world. The bustling, restless streets of Rome in the late 70s BC presented a vibrant and chaotic landscape of recovery, ambition, and intense political jockeying. Following the tumultuous death of Sulla, the Republic tried to stitch itself back together, though the deep fractures caused by civil war remained visible on every corner. For Gaius Julius Caesar, returning to the capital meant stepping onto a grand stage where power was no longer secured merely through quiet patrician birthright, but through active engagement with the public, clever financial engineering, and the dramatic arts of persuasion. He was a young man forged in the crucible of exile, piracy, and war, and he brought a hardened, clear-eyed perspective to the political arena. Caesar understood that the currency of the future was not just ancient lineage, but the favor of the Roman masses and the financial backing of the ultra-wealthy. His formal re-entry into public life began within the courts of Rome, where young, ambitious nobles traditionally established their reputations. Caesar chose to make his mark as an advocate, stepping before crowded tribunals to prosecute corrupt provincial governors who had abused their power. In the ancient judicial system, these high-profile trials served as theatrical stages where an orator could display his eloquence, curry popular favor, and signal his alignment with the interests of the common people. Caesar possessed a natural gift for public speaking. Unlike the stiff, archaic style favored by some traditional conservative senators, his delivery was passionate, direct, sharp, and laced with an intellectual clarity that captivated juries and packed the surrounding porticos with eager listeners. His voice was high-pitched, yet he commanded attention through the sheer intensity of his arguments and the precise choice of his words. Cicero, himself a master of Roman oratory, would later remark that Caesar possessed the most brilliant command of the Latin language of any man in Rome, noting with a mixture of admiration and unease that his speeches were delivered with an innate elegance and force. Yet, courtroom eloquence alone could not fund a modern political career in the late Republic. Elections in Rome were extraordinarily expensive affairs. Aspiring politicians were expected to finance lavish public games, sponsor magnificent building projects, distribute grain, and maintain vast networks of clients, all while accumulating monumental personal debts. Caesar embraced this financial reality with an audacity that terrified his creditors and astonished his peers. He borrowed staggering sums of money to finance his rise, operating on the principle that if a politician owed a modest sum, he was at the mercy of his creditors. But if he owed a fortune large enough to collapse the local banking houses, his creditors became his closest allies, deeply invested in his continued success and future political offices. He showered the people with lavish gifts, hosted unforgettable spectacles, and treated everyone from powerful senators down to the lowliest street plebeians with a warm, attentive charm that made every individual feel uniquely valued. Step by step, Caesar climbed the traditional political ladder, known as the cursus honorum. He secured election as a military tribune, then as quaestor in 69 BC, an office that required him to travel to the distant province of Further Spain to handle financial and administrative duties. Before departing for the Iberian Peninsula, Caesar suffered a profound personal and family grief with the death of his beloved wife Cornelia, followed closely by the passing of his aunt Julia, the widow of Marius. Traditional Roman custom forbade elaborate public eulogies for young women, but Caesar seized the moment to make a bold political statement. During his aunt's funeral procession, he shocked the conservative senators by publicly displaying the hidden busts and images of his uncle Marius, the great populist hero whom Sulla had sought to erase from history. When the crowd gasped at the sight of the proscribed general's face, Caesar delivered a passionate eulogy celebrating his family's glorious heritage, reminding the Roman people of their proud democratic lineage. It was a masterclass in political theater, demonstrating his uncanny ability to honor his family connections while challenging the fragile political settlement left behind by Sulla. Upon his arrival in Spain as quaestor, Caesar balanced administrative competence with moments of profound personal ambition. According to ancient biographers, while visiting the city of Ides, Caesar came across a magnificent statue of Alexander the Great standing inside a temple. As he gazed upon the likeness of the young Macedonian king who had conquered the known world before dying at the age of 32, Caesar reportedly wept. When his astonished companions asked the reason for his tears, Caesar replied with a statement that laid bare the driving engine of his soul. Did they not think it cause for sorrow that, while Alexander had already conquered vast empires at his age, he himself had as yet achieved no memorable distinction? The episode captured the sheer scale of his inner drive, a relentless hunger for glory that refused to be contained by the traditional boundaries of the Roman Senate. Returning to Rome with a restored reputation and a renewed sense of urgency, Caesar threw himself deeper into the political fray. He aligned himself with the popular faction, championing causes that directly benefited the urban poor and challenged the entrenched privileges of the conservative senatorial elite, known as the Optimates. In 63 BC, he ran for the prestigious and powerful religious office of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Roman religion. This was a high-stakes, lifelong position that carried immense political influence, and Caesar was running against two vastly older, immensely wealthy, and deeply respected consular candidates. Recognizing that failure would mean financial ruin under the crushing weight of the massive debts he had accumulated for the campaign, Caesar reportedly told his mother on the morning of the election, as she kissed him goodbye, that she would see him either return as chief priest or not at all. By the time the votes were tallied, Caesar had won a sweeping victory, securing more votes across the tribal assemblies than his two veteran opponents combined. The young outsider had captured the highest religious office in the state, proving that his charm, his generosity, and his connection to the common people possessed a political gravity that the traditional aristocracy could neither match nor stop. Following his stunning triumph as Pontifex Maximus, Gaius Julius Caesar found himself standing at the very center of Roman political life. Yet he remained acutely aware of the rigid glass ceiling imposed by the conservative senatorial elite. The traditional aristocracy, led by fierce defenders of the ancient constitution like Cato the Younger and conservative consuls, held firm control over the levers of the Senate. They were determined to block any ambitious upstart who threatened their oligarchic grip on the Republic. To break through this institutional barrier, Caesar realized that quiet courtroom speeches and populist charm would no longer be enough. He needed something far more potent, a grand alliance that could bypass traditional senatorial opposition, neutralize his political rivals, and clear his path toward the ultimate prize in Roman politics, the consulship. At this critical juncture in the mid-60s BC, Rome was dominated by two towering figures whose mutual hostility threatened to tear the Republic apart. The first was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, universally known as Pompey the Great. Pompey was the most celebrated military hero of his generation, having crushed rebellions in the East, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, and expanded Rome's borders into Asia Minor. He returned to Italy covered in glory, expecting the Senate to instantly ratify his eastern land settlements and grant farms to his thousands of battle-hardened veterans. Instead, the conservative senators, gripped by petty jealousy and fear of his immense popularity, deliberately stalled his requests, humiliating the greatest general alive and leaving his veterans out in the cold. The second major power player was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in the entire Roman world. Crassus had made his astronomical fortune through ruthless real estate speculation, silver mines, and fire brigades, and he had famously crushed the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. Yet despite his immense financial power and his influence over the wealthy merchant and banking class, known as the Equites, Crassus was constantly overshadowed by Pompey's military brilliance. The Senate routinely blocked Crassus's political initiatives and denied tax rebates to his business partners. Both Pompey and Crassus were powerful, frustrated, and blocked by the same conservative wall that sought to check Caesar's ambitions. Caesar, possessing a brilliant strategic mind and an unmatched talent for mediation, saw an extraordinary opportunity in their shared frustration. He understood that, while Pompey and Crassus hated and distrusted one another, neither could achieve his political goals alone. If Caesar could bring these two titans together and unite them with his own growing popularity and political momentum, they would form an unstoppable coalition that could dominate the Roman state. Working quietly and persuasively behind the scenes, Caesar bridged the deep chasm between Pompey and Crassus. He pointed out that their ongoing rivalry only benefited the narrow-minded conservative senators who wished to see them both diminished. Slowly, reluctantly, and out of sheer political necessity, the greatest general and the richest man in Rome agreed to bury the hatchet. Thus was born the first triumvirate, an informal, secret political pact that fundamentally reshaped Roman politics. This alliance was not an official office recognized by the Roman constitution, but rather a private agreement among three ambitious men to pool their resources, influence, and popularity. Under the terms of the pact, Caesar would run for the consulship of 59 BC, backed by Pompey's immense veteran network and Crassus's bottomless financial reserves. In return, once elected, Caesar would use his power as consul to push through the land grants for Pompey's veterans and secure the financial concessions demanded by Crassus's business associates. For Caesar, the alliance guaranteed his election to the highest office in the land and provided him with the formidable backing he needed to enact sweeping legislation. With the combined weight of the triumvirate behind him, Caesar launched his campaign for the consulship in 60 BC. The conservative optimates threw everything they had into opposing him, terrified of what a Caesar consulship would mean for their privileged status. They even pooled their own money to bribe the electorate on behalf of Caesar's conservative opponent, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, ensuring that Bibulus would win the second consulship slot to keep Caesar in check. Despite their best efforts, Caesar's personal popularity, combined with the clandestine muscle of Pompey and Crassus, secured his election as senior consul for the year 59 BC. Stepping into the consulship, Caesar wasted no time in demonstrating how the new balance of power would operate. Roman custom dictated that consuls alternate months presiding over the state, and Caesar took the initiative immediately during his active month. He proposed a comprehensive agrarian bill designed to purchase land in Italy and distribute it to Pompey's impoverished veterans and thousands of poor urban families. This was precisely the kind of popular reform the conservative Senate had blocked for Pompey. Knowing that the conservative senators would use procedural delays, religious technicalities, and endless speech-making to kill the bill in the Senate, Caesar bypassed the senatorial assembly entirely and brought the legislation straight to the popular assembly, the Comitia Centuriata. The conservative faction, led by Caesar's co-consul Bibulus and the staunch traditionalist Cato, fought back with fierce desperation. When Caesar presented the agrarian bill to the public assembly in the Forum, Bibulus attempted to halt proceedings by declaring that he had consulted the heavens and observed unfavorable omens, a traditional religious tactic used to legally suspend public business. Caesar, however, simply ignored the declaration, refusing to let ancient rituals block his political momentum. Enraged, Cato stood before the crowd and launched into a long, rambling speech designed to run out the clock until nightfall. Caesar's patience snapped. Demonstrating the ruthless efficiency that would define his career, Caesar ordered his lictors to physically drag Cato down from the rostra and remove him from the assembly by force. Stunned and humiliated, Cato shouted that tyranny had arrived in Rome. The conservative senators and Bibulus attempted to disrupt the vote with violence, but Pompey's veterans, who had quietly flooded the city, stepped forward and seized control of the Forum. Terrified for their safety, Bibulus and his conservative allies fled the meeting place. Bibulus retreated to his home, where he spent the remainder of his consulship claiming he was looking at the skies for bad omens every single day the assembly met, an empty legalistic protest that effectively paralyzed his own office while allowing Caesar to pass whatever laws he pleased. With his conservative opponents sidelined and his co-consul locked away in his mansion, Caesar governed with absolute authority for the rest of his term. He pushed through Pompey's eastern settlements, granted the tax relief demanded by Crassus's business allies, and passed a series of groundbreaking anti-corruption laws for the provinces. To further solidify the alliance within the triumvirate, Caesar arranged a strategic marriage between his beloved daughter, Julia, and his political partner, Pompey. Despite the political motivation behind the match, a genuine and deep affection quickly blossomed between the aging general and the young Julia, further binding the three men together. By the end of his consulship in 59 BC, Caesar had fundamentally altered the political landscape of Rome. The first triumvirate had proved that the traditional institutions of the Republic, the Senate, the assemblies, and the complex system of checks and balances, could be completely bypassed by men who commanded wealth, military power, and popular support. Caesar had achieved his consulship, delivered on his promises to his allies, and established himself as a dominant force in the Mediterranean world. Yet, as he looked toward the future, he knew that a consulship was only a temporary stepping stone. To truly secure his place in history and pay off the colossal debts he had accumulated, he needed a military command of his own. His eyes turned northward, toward the vast, untamed territories of Gaul, where glory, wealth, and an immense army awaited him. As his turbulent year as consul drew to a close, Gaius Julius Caesar turned his gaze toward the next critical phase of his grand political strategy. He knew that the immense financial debts he had accumulated to fund his political rise could never be settled through civilian office alone, nor could a mere consulship guarantee his long-term safety from the vengeful conservative elite waiting for him in Rome. To protect himself from prosecution, maintain his political relevance, and build an unbreakable power base, Caesar required a major military command. Through the political maneuvering of the First Triumvirate and the passage of the Lex Vatinia, followed by senatorial adjustments, Caesar was granted the proconsular command of Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and later Transalpine Gaul, along with a multi-year term and 4 seasoned legions. It was an appointment that placed him at the edge of the civilized Roman world and set the stage for one of history's most consequential military expansions. When Caesar arrived to take up his command in early 58 BC, he assumed control of a sprawling frontier zone that bordered the vast, fragmented and resource-rich territories of Celtic Gaul, known to the Romans as Gallia Comata, or long-haired Gaul. Gaul was not a single unified nation, but rather a complex mosaic of independent tribes, fiercely proud warrior cultures, and shifting alliances that frequently warred among themselves. Recognizing the deep divisions within the region, Caesar quickly realized that his mandate as governor offered an unprecedented opportunity for territorial conquest, legendary fame, and boundless wealth. More importantly, a prolonged military campaign far from the capital would keep him safely out of reach of his conservative enemies in the Senate, while allowing him to forge a private army bound to him by personal loyalty, shared hardship, and the promise of rich plunder. Almost immediately, the volatile security of the frontier provided Caesar with the perfect justification to launch proactive military operations. The Helvetii, a powerful Celtic tribe inhabiting modern-day Switzerland, decided to abandon their homeland, burn their settlements, and migrate en masse through Roman territory in search of fertile lands in western Gaul. Viewing this massive migration of hundreds of thousands of armed people as a direct threat to the stability of the Roman province, Caesar acted with swift and uncompromising decisiveness. He rapidly threw up fortifications along the Rhone, mobilized auxiliary units, and summoned his legions from Italy, setting the stage for a confrontation that would plunge him headfirst into the Gallic Wars. Through brilliant tactical deployments, forced marches, and calculated psychological warfare, Caesar intercepted and decisively defeated the migrating Helvetii, forcing the shattered remnants back to their ruined homeland. Having neutralized the immediate migration threat, Caesar did not pull back his forces. Instead, he responded to appeals from local Gallic factions seeking protection against aggressive Germanic tribes led by the warlord Ariovistus. Marching deep into unfamiliar territory, Caesar confronted and crushed the Germanic invaders, driving them back across the Rhine River and establishing Rome as the dominant arbiter of power well beyond its traditional provincial borders. With these rapid early victories, Caesar transformed his role from a regional provincial governor into an aggressive conqueror of new worlds. Every campaign was carefully calculated not only to secure strategic frontiers, but also to generate dazzling propaganda back home in Rome. Through his clear, precise dispatches sent regularly to the capital, the Roman public was captivated by tales of daring battlefield exploits, exotic foreign landscapes, and sweeping victories against formidable barbarian foes. Beneath the veneer of republican duty, Caesar was systematically constructing a massive political machine. The gold and treasures flowing back from his conquests lined his own pockets and satisfied his creditors, while the harsh realities of frontline warfare forged fierce, unshakable loyalty among his veteran legionaries. Caesar was no longer just a clever politician navigating the Senate House. He was a master military commander, whose ultimate destiny was now being forged in the blood, mud, and glory of the northern campaigns. The conflict in Gaul reached its absolute peak under the shadow of a fortified hilltop town known as Alesia. By the year 52 BC, the various Gallic tribes had finally put aside their bitter internal rivalries to unite under a single, brilliant commander, Vercingetorix, a charismatic young leader of the Arverni tribe. Recognizing that the Roman legions possessed superior discipline and could not easily be defeated in open battle, Vercingetorix chose a new strategy. He ordered his warriors to retreat into the heavily fortified hill settlement of Alesia, intending to use the high ground as a fortress and starve the invaders out over the coming winter. Julius Caesar immediately recognized the immense strategic weight of the moment. Instead of attempting a costly and bloody direct assault up the steep slopes of the hill, the Roman general made a bold decision that would define his military career. He chose to encircle the entire town and besiege the defenders. What followed was a masterpiece of ancient military engineering and logistics. Caesar ordered his tens of thousands of legionaries to construct an immense ring of fortifications, known as a line of circumvallation, stretching for over 10 miles around the base of the hill. This wooden wall was studded with watchtowers, deep trenches, and hidden traps designed to prevent the Gallic defenders from escaping. But Caesar's position quickly grew perilous. Realizing that a massive army was trapped inside Alesia, a colossal Gallic relief force numbering in the hundreds of thousands gathered across the region and marched to break the Roman lines. Suddenly, Caesar found himself caught in a trap of his own making. He was simultaneously besieging a massive army inside the town, while being surrounded from the outside by an even larger enemy relief force. To protect his men from this external threat, Caesar ordered the construction of a second, outward-facing wall, the line of contravallation, turning his army into a thin ring of defenders sandwiched between two hostile forces. Inside Alesia, the situation deteriorated rapidly as food supplies dwindled and starvation set in. In a desperate humanitarian crisis, the defenders expelled the non-combatants, including women and children, hoping that Caesar would take them in and spare their lives. But the Roman commander refused to admit them, leaving them trapped between the walls. As the external relief force launched coordinated assaults alongside desperate breakout attempts by Vercingetorix from within, the Roman lines were pushed to their absolute breaking point. Caesar, easily identifiable by his distinctive red cloak, galloped personally across the battlefield to rally his exhausted legionaries at points where the defenses were on the verge of collapsing. With the timely intervention of Germanic cavalry swinging around to strike the enemy from behind, the massive external Gallic relief force finally shattered and panicked, fleeing the field. Seeing all hope lost, Vercingetorix made the noble and tragic choice to save his surviving people. Donning his finest armor and riding his finest horse, the Gallic chieftain rode out alone to the Roman camp, dismounted, cast his weapons at Caesar's feet, and surrendered. The siege of Alesia broke the back of Gallic resistance once and for all, sealing the complete conquest of Gaul and transforming Caesar into an unstoppable legend across the ancient world. The smoke of Alesia had barely cleared when the foundation of the Roman world began to tremble. For nearly a decade, the vast expanse of Gaul had served as the private theater of Julius Caesar's glory, a place where he forged an invincible army, amassed staggering wealth, and commanded the unconditional adoration of his soldiers. Every victory across the Rhine and every triumph over northern tribesmen sent shockwaves of both jubilation and deep dread back to the capital. In Rome, the traditional elite watched with growing horror as their brilliant, debt-ridden provincial governor evolved into a colossus. Among the senators of the old guard, a profound realization took root. The Republic, built upon the delicate balance of shared power and checks and balances, could not long survive the shadow of a man who possessed so much personal power. The grand coalition that had once held the Roman world in a peaceful grip was fracturing, and the individuals who had once called each other brothers in arms were now hurtling toward an inevitable and catastrophic collision. To understand how the world of the late Republic tore itself apart, one must look back to the origins of that fragile political marriage known to history as the First Triumvirate. Formed in the year 60 BC, this secret pact had brought together three very different titans of Rome: Julius Caesar, whose extraordinary ambition was matched only by his staggering personal debts; Pompey the Great, the legendary military hero whose name was synonymous with conquest in the East, yet who had found himself politically stymied by a jealous and stubborn Senate; and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in the Republic, whose immense financial empire gave him behind-the-scenes control over vital political levers. By pooling their resources, influence, and popularity, these three men completely bypassed the traditional institutions of the Roman state. They dictated elections, secured land for veterans, and pushed through legislation with impunity, proving to all of Rome that the Senate was no longer the supreme master of the empire. Yet, this alliance was never built on genuine affection or shared ideology. It was a cold, calculated arrangement of convenience, held together solely by mutual interest and the ambition of its members. The glue that bound Caesar and Pompey particularly close was deeply personal. In the early days of their alliance, Caesar had offered his beloved daughter, Julia, in marriage to Pompey. Despite the vast difference in their ages, Julia was a young woman while Pompey was a middle-aged veteran of 100 campaigns. The marriage turned into a genuine love match. Pompey was utterly devoted to his young wife, and Julia held a deep affection for her husband. More importantly, Julia served as the vital human bridge between her father, fighting in the muddy tracks of Gaul, and her powerful husband, holding court in the marble halls of Rome. Whenever political whispers threatened to turn the Senate against Caesar, Julia and Pompey remained a united front, anchoring Caesar's interests in the heart of the capital. Then, in the autumn of 54 BC, tragedy struck a blow from which the Roman political landscape could never recover. While giving birth to her child, Julia died. The infant survived only a few days. The grief that engulfed Rome was profound, but the personal devastation felt by both men was immeasurable. Pompey was plunged into a deep, inconsolable mourning, losing the woman who had brought warmth and stability to his life. Caesar, receiving the grim news far away in the rain-swept camps of Gaul, was stricken with agonizing grief for his only daughter, even as he was forced to keep his mind fixed on ongoing military operations. With Julia's passing, the vital human link binding Caesar and Pompey snapped. The political marriage that had anchored the triumvirate was gone, leaving the two greatest generals of their generation exposed to the cold winds of suspicion and ambition. Compounding this disaster was the shifting balance of power in the East. Marcus Licinius Crassus, eager to match the military glory won by Pompey in Asia and Caesar in Gaul, had launched an ambitious and ill-fated invasion of the Parthian Empire. In the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, at the catastrophic Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, Crassus's grand army was utterly annihilated, and Crassus himself was killed, reportedly meeting a grisly end at the hands of his enemies. With the death of Crassus, the triumvirate was permanently reduced to a duopoly. The three-way balance that had kept individual ambitions in check was shattered. There were now only two men left standing at the summit of the Roman world: Pompey, who enjoyed the official backing of the Roman Senate and the prestige of the capital, and Caesar, who commanded 10 battle-hardened legions and the fierce, unbreakable loyalty of men who had followed him across the ends of the earth. Back in Rome, the Senate watched this dual dominance with mounting panic. Factions within the Optimates, the conservative aristocratic faction, began to actively court Pompey, whispering in his ear that Caesar was growing too powerful, too wealthy, and too dangerous to be allowed to return as a private citizen. They painted Caesar not as a Roman magistrate, but as a potential tyrant who intended to march his victorious legions down the sacred way and trample the liberties of the Republic beneath his hobnailed sandals. Slowly, insidiously, Pompey was drawn into their camp. Flattered by the Senate's sudden deference and unnerved by Caesar's meteoric rise in popularity, Pompey began to see his former father-in-law not as an ally, but as a rival who must be neutralized. The Senate reasoned that if they could strip Caesar of his provincial command before he was legally permitted to stand for a second consulship, Caesar would become an ordinary citizen vulnerable to prosecution by his political enemies, effectively ending his career overnight. Thus began a tense, high-stakes game of legal and political maneuvering in the Roman Senate. Caesar, still stationed in Gaul, understood the trap perfectly. If he returned to Rome without the legal protection of an active command, his enemies would drag him through the courts on trumped-up charges of treason, strip him of his property, and drive him into permanent exile. Everything he had fought for, his honor, his dignitas, and his immense achievements, would be swept away by a vindictive aristocracy. Yet legally, his term as governor of Gaul was drawing to its close, and the Senate was passing decree after decree demanding that he lay down his arms and disband his legions before he could even present himself as a candidate for political office. Messages, couriers, and angry letters flew back and forth across the Alps. Caesar offered compromise after compromise, proposing that both he and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously, ensuring a fair and balanced political playing field. But the Senate, emboldened by Pompey's military backing and blinded by their hatred for Caesar, repeatedly rejected every reasonable offer. They demanded total surrender, insisting that Caesar walk directly into the lion's den unarmed and defenseless. As the year 50 BC drew to its close, the political atmosphere in Rome grew thick with impending doom. Bribes were offered openly, mobs rioted in the streets, and ordinary citizens whispered in the forums that the old republic was breathing its last breaths. The final fracture became an unbridgeable chasm in the opening days of 49 BC. The tribunes of the plebs, those magistrates sworn to protect the rights of the common people, who had loyally supported Caesar's interests in Rome, were threatened with physical violence by the conservative senators. Fearing for their lives and stripped of their ability to speak for the people, these tribunes fled the city under the cover of night, disguising themselves as ordinary slaves and riding post-haste north to Caesar's camp at Ravenna. They arrived breathless and desperate, bearing the news that the Senate had declared a state of emergency, vesting Pompey with absolute authority to defend the Republic by any means necessary. For Caesar, this was the crossing of a legal Rubicon long before his physical boots ever touched the river's water. The Senate had cast aside the constitutional protections of the tribunes, signaling clearly that they considered Caesar and his supporters to be enemies of the state. Inside his headquarters at Ravenna, Caesar sat surrounded by his most trusted officers and advisors. The choice before him was stark and terrifying. He could obey the Senate's decree, disband his legions, and return to Rome as a broken, powerless citizen, leaving his legacy at the mercy of men who wished to destroy him. Or he could commit the ultimate treason, a crime recognized by every Roman as the most heinous offense possible against the state. He could lead his loyal legions across the northern border of his province and wage war against his own countrymen, plunging the entire Mediterranean world into the abyss of civil war. The silence in the tent must have been deafening as the general weighed the honor of the Republic against his own survival and ambition. The alliances forged in ambition, sealed by marriage and broken by death, had brought Rome to the absolute brink. There was no going back. The machinery of peace had completely collapsed, and the time for words had given way to the cold, unyielding logic of the sword. The small town of Ravenna sat at the very edge of Caesar's province, separated from Italy proper by a narrow, unassuming stream called the Rubicon. To any traveler, it looked like little more than a ditch cutting through the flat northern plains. Yet, in the bitter winter air of January in the year 49 BC, this tiny body of water stood as the legal and psychological boundary between civilization and chaos. Roman law was absolute on this point. No general was ever permitted to bring an army across the Rubicon into Italy. To do so while bearing arms was not merely an act of disobedience. It was treason of the highest order, an outright declaration of war against the Senate and the Roman people. Caesar knew that the moment his boots stepped across that water, there would be no turning back, no apologies accepted, and no forgiveness granted. Inside his headquarters, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Caesar had only one single legion with him at Ravenna, the 13th Legion. The rest of his veteran army was scattered far to the north and west across Gaul, weeks away from being able to offer reinforcements. If he chose to move forward, he would be marching into the heartland of Italy with a tiny force, relying entirely on speed, surprise, and the absolute loyalty of his men. The odds were daunting. Pompey commanded vast legions across the Mediterranean and held the immense resources, prestige, and financial backing of the Roman state. Yet, waiting meant handing his head to his enemies in the Senate. Every political compromise he had offered had been spurned with contempt. The aristocratic faction had made it clear that they wanted his complete destruction, leaving him with only two choices: surrender and ruin, or fight and risk everything. For hours, Caesar paced the room, wrestling with the magnitude of the decision. He spoke with his officers, weighing the terrible consequences of civil war. He knew what a conflict between Romans would cost the Republic: thousands of lives, ruined cities, and the collapse of the institutions that had guided Rome for centuries. Yet, as he later wrote and as his contemporaries noted, his sense of personal honor, his dignitas, was his life. To surrender it to men who hated him was impossible. As the cold winter evening began to close in around the camp, Caesar made up his mind. He ordered his troops to assemble quietly, without revealing their destination. When the legionaries gathered in the dark, Caesar addressed them briefly. He reminded them of the insults hurled against him by his political enemies, the denial of their hard-earned rewards, and the illegal driving of the tribunes from Rome. Above all, he reminded them of their 9 years together in Gaul, where they had conquered vast territories and achieved incredible victories under his command. The soldiers did not hesitate. Shouting their approval, they swore they would stand by their general and defend his honor against all enemies. The die was cast. The decision had moved from the realm of political debate into the unyielding domain of military action. Caesar and his small band of soldiers marched through the dark night toward the banks of the Rubicon. The winter wind whipped across the dark fields, and the waters of the stream ran low and cold under the starlight. According to ancient accounts, as Caesar reached the edge of the water, He paused for a long, silent moment. He understood the immense scale of the disaster he was about to unleash upon the Mediterranean world. Turning to his closest companions, he uttered the famous phrase that has echoed down through the centuries: "The die is cast." With those words, he urged his horse forward into the current, splashing across the shallow water and leading his men onto Italian soil. The news that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon struck Rome like a thunderbolt. Panic seized the capital with terrifying speed. The conservative senators, who had so boldly pushed for war while assuming Caesar would back down, were suddenly paralyzed by fear. They had convinced themselves that Caesar was too cautious to risk everything, and they had failed to raise an adequate defense force in Italy. Now, reality crashed down upon them. Reports flew through the streets that the invincible conqueror of Gaul was marching down the Flaminian Way with his bloodthirsty veterans, heading straight for the city at lightning speed. Pompey the Great found himself trapped in an impossible strategic nightmare. Despite his immense military reputation, he had no legions immediately available in central Italy to block Caesar's advance. His main forces were stationed far away in Spain, while his political allies in the Senate screamed at him for protection. Realizing that he could not defend Rome without risking a catastrophic defeat in the streets, Pompey made a fateful and humiliating decision. He chose to abandon the capital. He issued an emergency decree ordering all senators, magistrates, and loyal citizens to flee south with him, threatening that anyone who stayed behind in Rome would be treated as an enemy of the state. The evacuation of Rome was a scene of utter confusion and despair. Wealthy aristocratic families packed their most precious belongings onto wagons, abandoning their grand villas and estates. Senators, priests, and magistrates rushed through the gates in a chaotic mass, desperate to escape before Caesar's vanguard arrived. Ordinary citizens, left behind to face the conqueror, watched in bewilderment as the entire ruling class of the Republic packed up and fled southward toward the coast of Brundisium. The government of the world had deserted its home, leaving the ancient capital empty and terrified. As Caesar advanced through the towns of northern Italy, something unexpected happened. Rather than encountering fierce resistance, he was greeted as a liberator. The Italian cities, Ariminum, Pisorum, Fanum, and Ancona, opened their gates to him without firing a single arrow. The local populations, weary of aristocratic corruption, exhausted by decades of political violence, and remembering the brutal civil wars of Sulla a generation earlier, had no desire to die for the conservative Senate. Town after town welcomed Caesar, tearing down defensive banners and cheering his arrival. Even better for Caesar, the opposing soldiers stationed in these towns chose to abandon their posts rather than fight their fellow Romans, frequently deserting their commanders to enlist in Caesar's advancing army. Caesar's strategy during this rapid advance was defined by a clever policy of clemency. Unlike Sulla, who had filled Rome with proscriptions, terror, and blood, Caesar went out of his way to show mercy to his captured enemies. When he took towns defended by Pompeian forces, he ordered his men not to harm anyone, released captured officers unharmed, and even returned their personal property. This psychological warfare was brilliantly effective. By presenting himself as a benevolent, reasonable leader protecting the rights of the people against a corrupt oligarchy, Caesar won over the hearts and minds of the Italian public. He showed that he was not a wild-eyed tyrant seeking destruction, but a master politician who knew how to turn mercy into a weapon. Messages and frantic letters continued to pass back and forth between Caesar and the fleeing senators. Caesar attempted to maintain a veneer of negotiation, writing letters to Pompey and the consuls, proposing meetings to discuss peace, and urging them to return to Rome. Yet, These diplomatic gestures were little more than theater. Both sides knew that the time for words had long since passed. Pompey was already massing his forces in the south, preparing to cross the Adriatic Sea into Greece, where he could gather the immense wealth, fleets, and legions of the eastern provinces. He intended to starve Italy, cut off its grain supplies, and return with a massive coalition to crush the rebel general. By late winter, Caesar's army reached the gates of Rome itself. The city was quiet, tense, and nearly empty of its traditional magistrates. The tribunes who had fled to his camp were restored to their positions, and Caesar moved quickly to secure the public treasury, brushing aside minor senatorial resistance to access the funds needed to pay his troops. He did not linger in the capital. Recognizing that Pompey was slipping away toward the sea, Caesar turned his forces south in a desperate race to trap his rival before he could escape Italy. The pursuit led all the way down to the port city of Brundisium, where Caesar arrived just as Pompey's final ships were pulling away from the docks into the open waters of the Adriatic. Caesar looked out across the sea, watching the sails of his rival disappear into the horizon. He had failed to trap Pompey in Italy, but in doing so, he had achieved something equally monumental. In a matter of weeks, without fighting a single major battle, he had driven the entire Roman government into exile and taken total control of the Italian peninsula. The Rubicon had been crossed, the political games were over, and the old republic had ceased to function. What remained was a stark, brutal test of arms between two titans. The civil war had officially begun, and the fate of the entire Mediterranean world hung in the balance. With Pompey and the core of the Roman Senate safely across the Adriatic Sea in Greece, Julius Caesar found himself master of Italy and the western provinces. But he was acutely aware that the war was far from over. Pompey held the vast resources of the East, including wealthy client kingdoms, immense revenues, naval supremacy across the Mediterranean, and legions of experienced soldiers. To secure his position and prevent Pompey from returning with an overwhelming force to crush him, Caesar had to move with ruthless speed. His strategic problem was immense. Before he could turn his full attention to Pompey in the east, he had to neutralize Pompey's strong army stationed in Spain. If Caesar sailed across the Adriatic while leaving a hostile, battle-hardened army at his back in the Iberian Peninsula, he would risk being trapped between two forces. He chose to deal with the threat in Spain first, uttering a famous phrase that highlighted his logistical reality. He was setting off to fight an army without a leader, only to return to face a leader without an army. Leaving his loyal general Mark Antony in charge of the defense of Italy and Rome, Caesar marched his legions rapidly toward Spain. The campaign in Spain was a masterclass in swift military maneuvering, psychological pressure, and tactical innovation. Pompey's forces in Spain were commanded by experienced legates, Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius, who held strong defensive positions around the town of Ilerda. At first, the terrain and the clever positioning of the Pompeian army frustrated Caesar's attempts to bring them to a decisive battle. Heavy spring rains flooded the rivers, washing away Caesar's bridges and cutting off his supply lines from Gaul. For weeks, the two armies faced each other across muddy riverbanks in a tense standoff, and rumors began to circulate in Rome that Caesar was trapped and losing the campaign. Caesar, however, refused to be outmaneuvered. He ordered his engineers to construct lightweight transport boats modeled after those used by the Britons, covered with hides stretched over wicker frames, which allowed his men to cross swollen rivers secretly and regain the initiative. Utilizing speed, unexpected marches, and superior logistical management, Caesar gradually outflanked the Pompeian generals, cutting them off from their water supplies and surrounding their camps without having to engage in a costly, bloody assault. Instead of destroying his captured countrymen, Caesar once again applied his signature policy of clemency. Rather than slaughtering the defeated Spanish legions, he gave them the choice to be discharged or to join his ranks, paying them out of his own funds. By treating his captured enemies with respect and generosity, Caesar neutralized the Spanish threat in record time, winning the loyalty of the provincial populations and securing his rear flank in a brilliant campaign that lasted barely 40 days. Returning briefly to Italy, Caesar paused only to settle mounting civil unrest, address economic grievances, and prepare his invasion fleet. The situation in Rome remained fragile. Citizens were anxious, debts were heavy, and the absence of traditional magistrates created administrative chaos. Caesar acted decisively to restore calm, passing laws to ease the burden of debtors without canceling debts entirely, recalling political exiles, and restoring voting rights to marginalized groups to solidify his domestic support base. With Italy stabilized and his legions eager for action, Caesar turned his gaze eastward across the sea toward Greece, where Pompey was spending the winter gathering massive fleets and training a multinational army of senators, client kings, and allied troops. Transporting an army across the sea in the face of a superior enemy navy was one of the most perilous gambles of Caesar's career. Pompey's naval commander, Bibulus, patrolled the Adriatic with a massive fleet designed to intercept and destroy any troop transports. In January of 48 BC, Caesar executed a characteristically bold move. Embarking a portion of his army on a fleet of transport ships at Brundisium, he slipped across the open sea under the cover of winter storms, evading the bulk of the hostile patrols by landing at an unexpected point on the coast of Epirus rather than the heavily guarded ports. Once his troops were ashore, Caesar immediately sent the ships back across the stormy waters to fetch the remaining legions under Mark Antony, while he established a fortified camp to await reinforcements. The crossing of the second wave, however, proved to be a harrowing ordeal. Bibulus and the Pompeian fleet, enraged by their initial oversight, tightened their blockade of the Adriatic, making further crossings nearly impossible. Weeks dragged on with no sign of Mark Antony's ships, and the soldiers remaining in Italy began to despair. Driven by characteristic impatience, Caesar took an extraordinary risk. Disguised in a cloak as a common traveler, he boarded a small, 12-oared fishing boat in the dead of night, intending to sail back across the stormy sea himself to personally urge Antony and his men forward. According to ancient historians, when a terrifying gale blew up and the frightened boatmen wanted to turn back, Caesar revealed his identity to calm the terrified crew, famously telling the sailor, "Fear nothing. You carry Caesar and his fortune." Although the storm forced them to turn back before reaching Italy, Caesar's sheer audacity inspired his men, and shortly afterward, a change in wind direction allowed Mark Antony to slip through the blockade and land his legions safely, uniting the army at last. With his forces finally united, Caesar marched to confront Pompey, whose army vastly outnumbered his own. The two titans established rival camps near the ancient coastal city of Dyrrhachium. Here, a strange and grueling phase of the civil war unfolded. Rather than engaging in a traditional open battle, Caesar attempted to starve out his larger rival by building an immense wall of fortifications, completely encircling Pompey's army along the rugged hills by the sea. Pompey responded by constructing his own counterwalls and launching relentless amphibious raids against Caesar's lines. For weeks, both armies suffered terribly from hunger and disease. Caesar's men were reduced to eating a strange root called ora, baked into bread with milk, yet they maintained their fierce morale, declaring they would eat the bark off the trees before letting Caesar down. Eventually, Pompey found a weak spot in Caesar's sprawling, unfinished southern lines and launched a massive, coordinated attack from land and sea. Caesar's forces were overwhelmed and forced to retreat in disorder, suffering heavy casualties. It was the worst tactical defeat of Caesar's entire military career. A less resolute general might have panicked or attempted to retreat into Italy, but Caesar recognized that showing weakness would be fatal. He maintained his composure, ordered an orderly withdrawal, and addressed his disheartened troops with remarkable calm, acknowledging their mistake while reminding them of their past glories. Rather than wallowing in defeat, Caesar immediately broke camp and marched inland toward Thessaly, aiming to draw Pompey away from his secure naval supply lines and into open terrain where strategy and morale would matter more than pure numbers. Pompey and his aristocratic allies, flushed with their success at Dyrrhachium, were overconfident and eager for a final, decisive engagement. Many senators in Pompey's camp were already arguing over who would inherit Caesar's property and offices once he was eliminated, completely underestimating the resilience of their opponent. By early August of 48 BC, the two armies converged near the plains of Pharsalus. Pompey commanded roughly double the infantry of Caesar and possessed an overwhelming superiority in cavalry, which he intended to use to sweep around Caesar's flank and destroy his army from the rear. Caesar, though heavily outnumbered, and with his men exhausted from months of hard marching, possessed veteran legions whose absolute trust in their commander was unbreakable. On the morning of the battle, Caesar deployed his forces with meticulous care. Knowing that Pompey's massive cavalry force posed the greatest threat, Caesar detached a reserve force of his bravest infantrymen, hiding them behind his main line with strict instructions not to throw their javelins at a distance, but to thrust them directly into the faces of the enemy horsemen. When the battle began, Pompey's cavalry charged as expected, confident of an easy victory. As they swept around the flank, Caesar's hidden reserves sprang their trap, lunging forward with their javelins aimed at the eyes and faces of the aristocratic riders. Horrified by the sudden violence and unwilling to risk disfiguring their handsome faces, the panic-stricken cavalry broke ranks and fled in total confusion. With their flank exposed and unprotected, Pompey's cavalry abandoned the field, allowing Caesar's hidden infantry to wheel around and strike the main Pompeian line in the flank and rear. At the same moment, Caesar ordered his hardened veterans to press forward with maximum aggression across the entire front. The impact was devastating. Pompey's frontline troops, largely consisting of raw recruits and unseasoned allies, buckled under the fierce pressure of Caesar's battle-hardened veterans. Realizing that the battle was lost, Pompey did something unthinkable for a Roman commander of his stature. He lost his nerve, rode back to his tent, stripped off his general's cloak, mounted a horse, and fled the field in despair, leaving his army to fend for itself. The Battle of Pharsalus was a stunning, decisive triumph for Julius Caesar. The Pompeian army was completely shattered, with thousands killed or captured, while Caesar's losses were remarkably light. As Caesar walked across the battlefield after the fighting ended, viewing the bodies of Roman citizens scattered across the plains, he reportedly expressed deep sorrow, remarking that they had forced him to this extremity. True to form, he immediately issued orders sparing the lives of captured Roman citizens, pardoning many prominent senators who would later turn against him again. With his rival utterly defeated and his army scattered, Caesar knew that Pompey had fled across the sea toward Egypt to seek refuge with the young King Ptolemy Roman XIII. Leaving the remnants of his forces to secure Greece, Caesar boarded a small squadron of ships and set sail across the Mediterranean in swift pursuit, unaware that the dramatic final act of his rival's life was already awaiting them on the shores of the Nile. Following the dramatic events in Egypt and the swift campaigns in the East, Julius Caesar finally returned to Rome in the autumn of 46 BC as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The city he came back to was exhausted, deeply scarred by years of civil war, and fundamentally altered. For a man who had spent his entire life fighting within a shifting political system, victory brought both immense opportunity and profound responsibility. Caesar realized that winning the war was only the first step. Governing the fractured state and creating a lasting peace would require a different kind of genius. He stepped into a capital that held its collective breath, waiting to see what punishment or reward the victorious general would hand out to a populace that had divided its loyalties during the conflict. True to his political character, Caesar chose a path that shocked his traditionalist contemporaries, a policy of widespread clemency. Rather than executing his political opponents or confiscating the properties of surviving senators who had fought against him at Pharsalus or Thapsus, he pardoned them, welcoming many back into the political fold. He famously declared that his greatest victory would be to save the lives of fellow Roman citizens. This approach earned him the genuine gratitude of many ordinary citizens and middle-class Romans who feared a replay of Sulla's bloody proscriptions from decades earlier, though hardline Republicans remained deeply suspicious of his generosity, viewing it not as mercy, but as a calculated display of monarchical power. With absolute political dominance now resting in his hands, Caesar wasted no time in launching a massive program of legislative, social, and economic reforms aimed at stabilizing the trembling republic and modernizing the Roman state. The domestic problems facing Italy were severe. Years of neglect, agricultural disruption caused by the movement of armies, and heavy borrowing had pushed thousands of ordinary citizens and small farmers to the brink of ruin. Creditors were demanding repayment in cash that simply did not exist, leading to severe social unrest and the threat of widespread debt cancellation or violent riots. Caesar tackled the financial crisis with pragmatic restraint. He rejected radical calls for total debt cancellation, which would have ruined the financial markets, but he enacted laws that forced creditors to accept property as payment at pre-war land values, effectively writing off a significant portion of accumulated interest. This balanced approach relieved the unbearable pressure on debtors while keeping the financial system intact, preventing panic among property owners. At the same time, Caesar addressed the chronic urban unemployment in Rome, which had long served as a breeding ground for political violence and civil unrest. The city was overcrowded with impoverished citizens who depended on the public grain dole for survival. Caesar dramatically reduced the rolls of grain recipients by carefully auditing who actually qualified, cutting the number of dole recipients by more than half to ensure that only the truly destitute received state assistance. To solve the problem of joblessness and overcrowding, he launched an ambitious program of public works in Rome, building new basilicas, expanding the forum spaces, and constructing massive public buildings that provided steady employment for thousands of laborers. Beyond the capital, Caesar looked outward to solve the problem of landlessness among his veterans and the urban poor. Roman armies had grown into professional forces whose soldiers looked to their commander for their retirement security. In the past, providing land for veterans had caused bitter political battles in the Senate, but Caesar now possessed the authority, and the vast tracts of public and conquered land needed to solve the issue decisively. He organized the foundation of large-scale Roman colonies across the Mediterranean, sending thousands of veterans and poor citizens overseas to restart their lives. Cities like Carthage in North Africa and Corinth in Greece, which had lain in ruins for over a century since their destruction by the Roman military, were rebuilt as thriving Roman colonies. This not only relieved demographic pressure in Italy and rewarded his loyal veterans with fertile plots of land, but it also accelerated the process of Romanization, spreading Roman culture, law, and commerce across the provinces. In addition to economic and social measures, Caesar turned his sharp intellect toward administrative reform, tackling problems that had plagued the Roman state for generations. One of his most enduring and practical achievements was the total overhaul of the Roman calendar. For centuries, the traditional Roman calendar had relied on a lunar cycle that frequently fell out of sync with the solar year, requiring priests to insert intercalary months manually. Over time, political corruption and negligence among the pontiffs had thrown the calendar months completely out of alignment with the actual seasons. Festivals meant for harvest time were occurring in the dead of winter. To fix this monumental confusion, Caesar consulted with leading astronomers and mathematicians, most notably Sosigenes of Alexandria, and introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BC. This new system adopted a solar year of 365 and a quarter days, introducing a leap year every 4 years to keep the calendar permanently synchronized with the Earth's orbit around the Sun. Although it required an exceptionally long transitional year of 445 days to reset the system, a year the Roman wits jokingly referred to as the last year of confusion, the Julian calendar provided a stable, scientific framework for timekeeping that would serve Western civilization for more than a millennium and a half, surviving virtually unchanged until the introduction of the Gregorian calendar in the late 16th century. Caesar also sought to integrate the wider Mediterranean world into the traditional structures of Roman governance. Recognizing that the empire had outgrown the narrow confines of the city-state administration, he expanded the membership of the Roman Senate from 600 to 900 individuals. To fill these new seats, he brought in prominent provincial leaders from Gaul, Spain, and Italy, widening the ruling class and building administrative bridges between Rome and the provinces. While traditionalist senators viewed this move as an insult to the ancient dignity of the assembly, grumbling that foreign-born nobles were now walking the Senate floor wearing the purple-bordered toga, it reflected Caesar's pragmatic understanding that the Republic had become a vast empire requiring a broader base of political participation. He granted full Roman citizenship to various communities and professional groups, such as doctors and teachers, regardless of their ethnic origins, encouraging loyalty to the central state and breaking down the rigid barriers between Romans and provincials. Furthermore, Caesar reformed provincial administration to curb the rampant corruption and extortion that had plagued governors for generations. He limited the terms of provincial governors, set strict caps on the administrative expenses they could force local populations to pay, and established specialized courts to prosecute officials who abused their power. These measures protected the vulnerable populations of the provinces from financial ruin, and ensured that tax revenues flowed more reliably and fairly into the Roman treasury. Despite the sweeping nature of these reforms, and the genuine benefits they brought to millions of subjects across the Mediterranean, Caesar's consolidation of authority created an atmosphere of deep unease in Rome. As he enacted these changes, he did so not through the traditional consensus of magistrates and the Senate, but through his own personal decrees and absolute authority. In recognition of his dominance, the Senate showered him with extraordinary honors, naming him Dictator in perpetuity, granting him the right to sit on a golden chair in the Senate House, and placing his image on coins. While Caesar presented himself as a benevolent ruler working tirelessly for the good of the state, the concentration of so much power in the hands of a single individual alarmed those who still cherished the traditions of the old republic. To many Romans, a dictator for life was not a magistrate holding a temporary emergency power, but a king in disguise, an existential threat to the liberty that Rome had fought for centuries to preserve. Caesar's busy days in his newly reorganized capital were filled with drafting laws, receiving delegations from distant provinces, and planning further monumental projects, including massive public works and military campaigns against the Parthian Empire. Yet, beneath the veneer of stability and reform, a quiet storm was gathering among the aristocratic elite. The very senators he had pardoned and elevated were watching his every move, growing increasingly convinced that the republic was dead, and that only the removal of the dictator could restore their lost freedom. Caesar remained confident in his security, often dismissing his personal bodyguards and walking freely among the citizens, believing that his clemency and his popularity with the common people were his best protection. He failed to see that the political machine he had mastered had reached a breaking point, and that the sweeping transformation of Rome from a fragile republic into an autocracy was about to reach its most violent and decisive turning point. As Julius Caesar continued to reshape the administrative structures of the Mediterranean world from his base in Rome, the political atmosphere within the city grew increasingly heavy with tension and unspoken dread. The reforms that had stabilized the economy and restored public buildings were undeniable, but the manner in which they were implemented left little room for the traditional checks and balances of the Roman Republic. Caesar was no longer merely a successful general or a dominant consul. He stood alone at the apex of the state, holding absolute power that defied the constitutional traditions cherished by generations of Roman senators. Every decree, every administrative appointment, and every public appearance served as a stark reminder that the old ways of governance had been permanently eclipsed by a single individual's will. For the traditionalist members of the aristocracy, this concentration of supreme authority was not just a political shift. It was an existential crisis that threatened the very soul of Rome. The unease began to manifest in the growing list of unprecedented honors that the Senate, alternating between genuine adulation and fearful submission, showered upon the dictator. Day by day, the boundaries separating a temporary Roman magistrate from an absolute monarch eroded. The Senate voted to grant Caesar the title of dictator in perpetuity, a designation that shattered the republican tradition of term limits and emergency powers. Under this new decree, his authority would never expire, cementing his status as a permanent ruler for life. Statues of Caesar were erected across the city bearing inscriptions that rivaled those of gods and ancient kings, and his profile began to appear regularly on Roman coinage, a privilege previously reserved for deified ancestors or mythical heroes, never for living citizens. Inside the Senate House, Caesar was granted the right to sit upon an elevated golden chair, a symbol of majesty that set him physically apart from his fellow senators. When he entered public spaces, he was preceded by lictors bearing the fasces without the traditional axes removed, signaling absolute power over life and death even within the sacred boundaries of the pomerium. These unprecedented distinctions sent shockwaves through the conservative elite. To the senatorial class, who had been raised on the heroic tales of the founders who expelled the Tarquin kings centuries earlier, the word king was the ultimate taboo, an intolerable insult to Roman liberty. Yet, Despite these alarming developments, Caesar himself walked a delicate and contradictory line regarding the trappings of monarchy. He publicly rejected some of the more overt symbols of kingship, most famously during the festival of the Lupercalia in early 44 BC, when Mark Antony repeatedly attempted to place a royal diadem upon his head in front of the assembled crowds in the Forum. Each time Antony offered the crown, the crowd responded with a mixture of anxious silence and murmurs, and each time Caesar pushed it away amid rising applause from the common people, finally ordering the diadem to be taken to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Whether this dramatic episode was a genuine refusal of royal power or a carefully calibrated test of public sentiment remains a subject of intense historical debate, but the very fact that such a scene could take place in the heart of Rome terrified those who believed that a monarchy was already being established in all but name. Compounding this domestic political anxiety was Caesar's increasingly prominent and controversial relationship with Queen Cleopatra Roman VII of Egypt. Following his victories in the East and his brief campaign in Egypt, Cleopatra had traveled to Rome accompanied by her royal court, taking up residence in Caesar's private villa just across the Tiber River. For conservative Romans, the presence of an exotic foreign queen on Roman soil was deeply unsettling, stirring up ancient prejudices against Eastern monarchies and fueling dark suspicions about Caesar's ultimate ambitions. Whispers circulated through the elite dining rooms and porticos that Caesar intended to move the capital of the Roman world to Alexandria or Ilium, or that he planned to marry Cleopatra and legitimize their young son, Caesarion, as heir to a unified Mediterranean empire. While there is no historical evidence that Caesar ever intended to abandon Rome or subvert Roman law for dynastic ambitions in the East, the visible association with a powerful foreign queen played directly into the hands of his critics, who painted him as a man infatuated with absolute power and detached from Roman values. Ordinary citizens, however, viewed these grand spectacles and foreign alliances through a very different lens. To the masses of Rome, who crowded the streets to witness triumphs, games, and the distribution of grain, Caesar was a benevolent protector who had rescued them from chaos and provided stability and employment. They cheered his monuments, marveled at the exotic animals and treasures brought from distant lands, and felt a sense of reflected glory in his unmatched achievements. But this deep popular adoration only heightened the paranoia of the senatorial elite. They watched in despair as the public forums, theaters, and temples filled with tributes to one man, realizing that elections had become hollow rituals where candidates were chosen simply because Caesar willed it. The Senate, once the proud council that directed the destiny of an empire, had been reduced to a rubber stamp for the dictator's decrees, its benches crowded not just with traditional Roman nobles, but with new members drawn from the provinces whom Caesar had elevated to dilute the power of the old families. As the months passed, Caesar's daily routine reflected the immense weight of governing a sprawling empire entirely on his own shoulders. From dawn until late afternoon, his private quarters and public offices were thronged with petitioners, provincial governors seeking guidance, architects planning new basilicas, and generals receiving orders for forthcoming campaigns. He was already making preparations for a massive military expedition against the Parthian Empire, a campaign designed to avenge the disastrous defeat of Crassus at Carrhae nearly a decade earlier, and to secure the eastern frontiers of Rome once and for all. This impending departure added a frantic urgency to the political landscape. Senators who opposed his rule knew that once Caesar left Italy at the head of another massive army, his dominance would be institutionalized beyond any hope of reversal, and the Republic would be buried so deep that it could never be resurrected. The fear of perpetual subjugation began to transform quiet grumblings into active, desperate plotting among the aristocratic elite. They looked upon Caesar's growing power and saw a king in everything but name, a tyrant whose continued existence made a mockery of Roman freedom. Unbeknownst to Caesar, who dismissed his personal bodyguards and walked freely among the citizens in the belief that his clemency and popularity were his truest shield, a dangerous conspiracy was slowly taking shape in the shadows of the Capitol, bringing together embittered Republicans, former Pompeians whom he had pardoned, and even some of his own close associates who had grown disillusioned with the trajectory of the Roman state. The transition from quiet grumblings of discontent to an active, organized conspiracy against Julius Caesar did not happen overnight. It was forged in the quiet libraries, secluded villas, and tense private dining rooms of Rome's aristocratic elite, where men who had spent their lives believing they were the natural guardians of the Roman state met in whispered conferences. The realization that Caesar's absolute rule was not a temporary emergency measure, but a permanent restructuring of the Roman world, forced these traditionalists to confront a bitter choice. They could either bow their heads and accept a life of political irrelevance under a benevolent autocrat, or they could risk everything to strike down the master of Rome and attempt to resurrect the long-fading traditions of the Republic. For a small group of senators, the answer became a terrifying moral and political duty. At the center of this gathering storm was a circle of men united not by uniform backgrounds, but by a shared sense of grievance, fear, and ideological commitment to the old ways. Some were veterans of the Civil War who had fought alongside Pompey against Caesar, men whose lives and properties had been spared only through Caesar's famous policy of clemency. While they outwardly accepted his pardon and even received offices from his hand, the bitter taste of defeat and the humiliation of owing their political existence to a conqueror rankled deeply within their souls. Others were former supporters of Caesar himself, men who had shared in his triumphs, enjoyed his patronage, and risen to positions of authority under his regime, yet had grown deeply disillusioned as they watched the institutions of the state trampled underfoot. They saw a dictator who bypassed the Senate, ignored the magistrates, and treated the ancient constitution as mere parchment to be altered at whim. Among these disillusioned insiders, two figures emerged as the intellectual and moral anchors of the conspiracy: Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Their involvement transformed the plot from a desperate factional vendetta into a movement that claimed to speak for the conscience of Rome itself. Gaius Cassius Longinus was a man of fierce intelligence, military experience, and burning ambition. Unlike many of his peers, Cassius was driven by a sharp, pragmatic hatred of tyranny and a personal resentment of Caesar's supreme status. Having served as a legate under Crassus and later commanded a fleet for Pompey, Cassius had a realistic view of military power and political manipulation. He understood that Caesar would never voluntarily relinquish his supreme command, and he recognized that time was running out. Every month that passed saw Caesar's authority more deeply entrenched, his veterans more securely settled, and the institutional memory of the Republic fading further into the past. Cassius became the driving force of the conspiracy, the one who urged action, recruited key conspirators, and brushed aside hesitation. Yet Cassius knew that a successful assassination required more than just angry malcontents. It needed moral legitimacy, a figurehead whose very name commanded respect across the political spectrum of Rome. That moral anchor was Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus possessed a lineage that tied him directly to the foundational myths of the Roman Republic. Through his mother, Servilia, He was descended from Servilius Ahala, an ancient hero who had slain a would-be king centuries earlier. On his paternal side, he traced his ancestry back to Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary statesman who had expelled the last Tarquin king from Rome in 509 BC and established the liberties of the Roman people. For a man bearing such a name, the current political reality was an unbearable contradiction. Every time Brutus walked through the Forum and saw the statues of Caesar inscribed with divine honors, or heard the senators whisper about an impending monarchy, his ancestral heritage seemed to cry out for action. Caesar himself held a deep, paternal affection for Brutus. During the Civil War, upon learning that Brutus was safe after the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar had specifically ordered his commanders to spare him. He had showered Brutus with honors, appointed him to high office, and treated him almost like a son. This personal bond made Brutus's internal struggle agonizing. He was torn between his genuine gratitude and affection for the man who had spared his life and his deep-seated ideological commitment to the Republic. The conspirators understood the immense value of Brutus's participation. Cassius and the other plotters worked tirelessly to cultivate this inner conflict, whispering in his ear, leaving anonymous notes on his ancestral tribunal, and reminding him of his duty to his family name. They scrawled messages on the base of his ancestor's statue in the Capitol, asking, "Are you asleep, Brutus? And do you truly believe you are a Brutus?" Gradually, the weight of tradition and the pressure of his peers tipped the scales. Brutus convinced himself that Caesar's personal virtues were irrelevant compared to the existential threat he posed to Roman liberty. He persuaded himself that he was not killing a friend, but a tyrant, and that by doing so, he would restore the Republic to its rightful owners. With Brutus on board, the conspiracy gained a new gravity, drawing in other disaffected senators who might otherwise have remained cautious bystanders. Among them was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, a trusted military commander and close friend of Caesar, whom Caesar had even named as an alternate heir in his will. Decimus's betrayal was particularly sharp, demonstrating how deeply the rot of distrust had spread within Caesar's inner circle. Other conspirators included men like Trebonius, Tullius Cimber, and Servius Sulpicius Galba, all seasoned politicians and administrators who shared a common dread of the future. As the plotters met in secret under the cover of night, holding their gatherings in private homes and secluded gardens to avoid the watchful eyes of Caesar's spies and informers, they debated the logistics and the timing of their strike. They faced a daunting set of challenges. Caesar was heavily guarded when moving through the city, though his reluctance to maintain a permanent bodyguard for public appearances left windows of vulnerability. More importantly, the conspirators had to decide what would happen immediately after the deed was done. Cassius argued that Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal co-consul and a powerful military figure in his own right, should be eliminated alongside Caesar to prevent him from rallying Caesar's veterans and plunging Rome into immediate civil war. But Brutus firmly and fatally vetoed this proposal. Brutus insisted that the assassination must be an act of pure justice, not a bloody factional purge. He believed that killing Antony would stain the purity of their cause and make them look like common murderers, rather than liberators restoring the Constitution. This fateful decision would haunt the conspirators in the days and weeks to come, leaving a dangerous rival free to rally the masses against them. As the conspirators refined their plans, the political calendar provided them with a specific deadline. Caesar was scheduled to depart Rome in a matter of weeks to lead a massive military campaign against the Parthian Empire. Once he left Italy at the head of a new army, any hope of striking him down within the institutional heart of the state would vanish. The senators involved in the plot knew that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. They had to act before Caesar's departure, while he was still attending meetings of the Senate in Rome. The tension within the group reached a fever pitch as they selected the exact location for the deed. It would not be in the crowded forum, where popular reaction could easily turn violent, nor in Caesar's private home, but during an official meeting of the Senate. This choice carried immense symbolic weight. They would strike the dictator down inside the very Senate house, under the eyes of his peers, portraying the act not as a cowardly ambush, but as an execution carried out by the legitimate representatives of the Roman state. As the conspirators finalized their oaths and prepared their concealed daggers, the atmosphere in Rome grew heavy with foreboding. Omens were whispered among the populace. Strange portents were reported in the skies, and even Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, began to experience troubled dreams filled with premonitions of disaster. Yet the plotters remained steadfast, blind to the chaos their idealistic vision would unleash. They believed that once the tyrant was gone, the Senate would naturally resume its ancient authority, the people would rejoice in their recovered freedom, and the republic would rise anew from the ashes of autocracy. They were entirely unaware that the republic they sought to save was already a ghost, and that their desperate blow would not restore the past, but instead shatter the Roman world into a new era of catastrophic civil war. The Ides of March in the year 44 before Christ dawned upon a city, already heavy with foreboding, tension, and whispered rumors. For weeks, the atmosphere in Rome had been thick with anxiety, charged with an inexplicable sense that some great, irreversible shift was hanging in the balance. Strange portents and supernatural omens were frantically whispered among the populace, from the bustling markets of the Subura to the elite marble porticos of the Palatine Hill. People spoke in hushed tones of phantom armies clashing in the night skies, of spectral lights flickering over the forum, of solitary birds of ill omen perching upon public monuments, and of sacrificial animals discovered by augurs to possess missing or deformed entrails. To a deeply superstitious Roman society, these signs were unmistakable harbingers of divine wrath or impending catastrophe. Yet, amidst these escalating fears and public anxieties, the most visceral and terrifying warnings had struck closest to home, within the private chambers of Julius Caesar himself. On the night before the fateful Senate meeting, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had suffered a night of harrowing, restless torment, racked by terrifying nightmares in which she saw her husband stabbed repeatedly, bleeding in her arms, and watched the roof of their home collapse around them. In her sleep, she had wept and cried out in terror, waking up with the absolute, unshakable conviction that her husband's life was in mortal peril. When morning came, Calpurnia begged Caesar with tears in her eyes not to leave the safety of their home, imploring him to postpone the Senate meeting, to consult professional diviners, and to heed the ominous warnings that haunted her soul. Moved by her distress and troubled by his own unusual physical unease, Caesar hesitated. He was not a man easily swayed by superstition, yet the sheer intensity of his wife's grief, combined with the unfavorable sacrifice readings performed that very morning by the chief diviner, Spurina, caused him to seriously consider remaining indoors. He sent word to the Senate House that he would not be attending the session that morning, a decision that threatened to unravel the meticulously crafted plans of the conspirators and plunge them into sudden, desperate panic. For months, the plotters had poured their entire existence into orchestrating this single moment, meeting in secret, hiding daggers, and sealing oaths of blood and honor. Now, as the morning hours ticked away and word reached the conspirators that Caesar was lingering at home, the fragile architecture of their conspiracy teetered on the brink of collapse. If Caesar failed to appear, word of their plot might leak, informers might betray them, and they would be left exposed to the merciless wrath of a dictator who had previously shown them unwarranted clemency. It was at this critical juncture that Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus demonstrated his vital, chilling role in the conspiracy. Decimus, a trusted friend whom Caesar held in high regard and had even named as an alternate heir in his will, was among the group of senators who had gone to Caesar's residence to escort him to the Senate. Finding Caesar hesitant and listening to Calpurnia's tearful pleas, Decimus immediately went to work, employing a mixture of clever flattery, subtle manipulation, and gentle mockery. He urged Caesar not to insult the Senate by failing to appear when they had gathered specifically at his command to pass measures granting him unprecedented honors, including the right to wear the diadem outside of Italy. Decimus argued that it would be shameful for the dictator to give credence to superstitious old wives' tales and cowardly dreams, warning Caesar that his enemies would use his absence to claim he was afraid of the very body he dominated. Swayed by this persuasive counsel, his pride touched by the insinuation of cowardice, Caesar allowed himself to be convinced. He rose from his couch, bid farewell to his weeping wife, and stepped out of his villa, walking forth into the bright morning sunlight, completely unaware that he was walking directly toward his doom. The location chosen for this historic confrontation was not the traditional Curia Julia, which was still under construction, but the Curia of Pompey, a magnificent administrative and meeting hall attached to the grand theater complex built by Caesar's old rival, Pompey the Great. This geographic irony was not lost on the conspirators. Striking down the dictator inside a building erected by the man he had vanquished in civil war added a grim, poetic symmetry to their enterprise. As Caesar made his way through the streets of Rome, flanked by a modest group of friends, clients, and attendants, the atmosphere grew increasingly dense with anticipation. Along the route, a Greek teacher named Artemidorus, who had somehow uncovered fragments of the plot, pressed forward through the bustling crowd and thrust a written scroll directly into Caesar's hand, urgently whispering that Caesar must read it immediately because it contained matters of vital, life-or-death importance. But Caesar, burdened by the weight of the scroll and accustomed to receiving countless petitions from citizens and suppliants every day, merely tucked it away among his other papers, intending to read it later. He walked onward, engaging in casual conversation with those around him, never realizing that this single missed document was his final earthly chance at salvation. Meanwhile, inside the Curia of Pompey, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, almost unbearable tension. The conspirators were already assembled in their designated places, their hearts pounding against their ribs, their palms sweating as they gripped the short, double-edged daggers concealed beneath the heavy folds of their woolen togas. They sat among their fellow senators, exchanging nervous glances, speaking in strained whispers, and fighting to maintain an outward mask of calm, while inside their minds were racing with the terrifying realization of what they were about to do. Every creak of the heavy oak doors, every footstep echoing in the portico outside, sent a sharp spike of adrenaline through their veins. They were a band of men balanced on the absolute edge of history, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would irrevocably alter the destiny of the Roman world. When Caesar finally arrived at the theater complex, he was met by a welcoming committee of senators who stepped forward to greet him with traditional displays of respect and deference. Several conspirators immediately crowded around him, forming a tight, protective ring that subtly separated Caesar from his bodyguards, his friends, and any potential defenders. Among them was Julius Caesar, who advanced toward Caesar with an urgent petition, falling to his knees and grasping the dictator's toga in a theatrical plea for the recall of his exiled brother. Caesar, annoyed by the sudden display of public supplication, and attempting to pull away, tried to signal Cimber to wait for a more appropriate time. But Cimber persisted, gripping the fabric of Caesar's toga even tighter with both hands, pulling down the garment from his shoulder to expose his neck. This was the prearranged signal, as Caesar cried out in surprise and anger, demanding to know what kind of violence this was. Tullius Cimber gave the physical cue that unleashed the pent-up fury of the conspiracy. In an instant, the air inside the grand hall erupted into chaos. Servilius Casca, standing directly behind the trapped dictator, drew his hidden dagger and delivered the very first strike, aiming a clumsy, glancing blow at Caesar's neck. Caesar reacted with lightning-fast reflexes, spinning around to catch Casca by the arm, crying out in Latin, "You villain, Casca, what are you doing?" Casca, terrified and losing his nerve, shouted out in Greek to his fellow conspirators for assistance, calling upon them to strike. Immediately, the rest of the plotters surged forward like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey, drawing their concealed blades and rushing toward the center of the room. The grand hall became a whirlwind of flying togas, flashing steel, shouted curses, and frantic, scrambling movements. Senators who were not part of the plot panicked, screaming in absolute terror, scrambling over benches, and fleeing blindly toward the exits, desperate to escape the slaughter before they too were caught in the crossfire. Caesar fought back with desperate, fierce energy, twisting, turning, and trying to defend himself against the sudden onslaught of blades flashing from every direction. He lashed out with his stylus, striking one of his attackers, but he was hopelessly outnumbered and trapped within a ring of desperate men determined to see him dead. Dagger thrusts began to rain down upon him from all sides, tearing through his purple-bordered toga, inflicting multiple superficial and deep wounds across his arms, shoulders, and chest. Blood began to soak through his garments, pooling brightly on the marble floor of the curia. Yet, even as he suffered wound after wound, Caesar continued his frantic struggle to break free, until he caught sight of a figure he never expected to raise a hand against him. Stepping forward into the fray with his own dagger drawn was Marcus Junius Brutus, the young man whom Caesar had treated almost like a son, spared on the battlefield of Pharsalus, and showered with honors and affection. When Caesar's eyes locked onto Brutus, seeing the familiar face twisted with intense resolve and bearing down upon him with a raised blade, the dictator's fierce resistance suddenly collapsed. According to ancient historians, upon seeing Brutus among his executioners, Caesar pulled his toga up over his head to cover his face, resigning himself to his fate, and spoke his final words in Greek. "You too, my child." With no further will to fight, Caesar allowed himself to be driven backward by the relentless rain of blows until he reached the heavy stone base of the statue of Pompey the Great, which stood proudly at the front of the hall. There, beneath the stone gaze of his fallen rival, Caesar collapsed to the floor, his body riddled with 23 knife wounds, bleeding out rapidly upon the marble tiles of the Senate house he had sought to conquer. An eerie, stunned silence instantly descended upon the curia of Pompey, broken only by the ragged breathing of the assassins and the distant screams of fleeing citizens echoing from the streets outside. The conspirators stood motionless in the center of the blood-stained hall, their hands, faces, and daggers smeared with crimson, staring down at the lifeless body of the most powerful man in the Mediterranean world. For a few suspended moments, time seemed to stand completely still as the full, terrifying weight of what they had just done settled upon their minds. They had expected that the moment the tyrant fell, the rest of the Senate and the citizens of Rome would immediately erupt into joyful celebration, throwing off their chains, rushing into the streets, and joyfully proclaiming the restoration of the ancient republic. Instead, they were met with absolute chilling emptiness. The other senators had fled in blind terror, barricading themselves in their homes, while the common people of Rome, watching from afar, were paralyzed by shock, confusion, and deep, instinctive dread. The assassins realized with a sinking feeling in their stomachs that their idealistic dream of a restored constitution was vanishing into thin air. Waving their blood-stained daggers high above their heads, Brutus and Cassius attempted to address the empty hall, shouting out slogans of liberty and freedom, and proclaiming that tyranny was dead. But there was no answering cheer, no joyous crowd to greet them as liberators. Instead, clutching their weapons with trembling hands, the conspirators marched out of the Curia and into the streets of Rome, parading through the Forum while calling on the citizens to reclaim their freedom. Yet the response they received was not the triumphant awakening they had envisioned. It was a profound, suffocating silence. The ordinary people of Rome did not see heroes of liberty. They saw murderers who had plunged the state back into uncertainty. As the shock wave of the assassination radiated outward through the city, wrapping every street and alley in a heavy shroud of foreboding, the conspirators began to realize the horrifying truth. They had not saved the Republic. They had merely signed its death warrant, opening the floodgates to a new, even more catastrophic era of civil war that would consume them all. The chaos that unfolded across Rome in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar was unlike anything the city had experienced in living memory. The sun on the afternoon of March 15, 44 BC, beat down upon a population paralyzed by shock and disbelief. Ordinary citizens locked their doors, bolted their windows, and hid within their homes, whispering among themselves about what the murder of the dictator would mean for their daily lives. The elite senators who had plotted the assassination expected a spontaneous wave of public euphoria, believing the populace would instantly flood the Forum to celebrate the return of freedom and the ancient constitutional order. Instead, they found themselves staring into a vast, silent void of public dread. The streets emptied rapidly as news of the violent deed spread from the Curia of Pompey into the crowded markets and residential quarters of the Suburra. People feared that rival armies would march into the city, that widespread looting would break out, or that Caesar's loyal veteran legions, stationed just outside Italy or scattered across the provinces, would exact a terrible and bloody vengeance upon the capital. The conspirators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, soon realized that their idealized vision of a restored republic was rapidly dissolving into a dangerous political vacuum. Holding their bloody daggers aloft, they marched out of the theater district and into the Roman Forum, shouting slogans of liberty, freedom, and the death of tyranny. Yet the crowd that watched them passed no cheers and offered no applause. The faces peering out from behind wooden shutters and market stalls reflected deep anxiety rather than liberation. The common people of Rome had loved Caesar, not only for his charismatic personality and grand public spectacles, but because he had championed debt relief, grain distributions, and land settlements for the poor. To the ordinary Roman citizen, the men who called themselves liberators looked less like heroes and much more like assassins who had dragged the state back into the dark abyss of political instability. Recognizing that the public mood was hostile and volatile, Brutus and Cassius wisely decided to withdraw to the relative safety of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, where they could confer with their fellow conspirators and decide their next move. As the afternoon faded into evening, the political leadership of Rome scrambled to fill the terrifying void left by Caesar's death. Two men emerged as the primary power brokers in the hours and days that followed: Marcus Antonius, commonly known as Mark Antony, who was Caesar's co-consul and closest political lieutenant, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the commander of the army stationed near Rome. Mark Antony initially feared that he too might be targeted by the conspirators and barricaded himself inside his private residence, donning civilian clothes and awaiting the worst. However, when scouts brought back word that the assassins had no broader military support within the city and were hesitant to take aggressive action, Antony recognized an extraordinary opportunity to seize control of the political narrative. Drawing upon his considerable political acumen and persuasive abilities, he reached out to the conspirators through intermediaries, proposing a fragile truce. Antony understood that an immediate counterattack by Caesar's veterans would plunge Rome into total civil war, yet he also knew that he could not simply ignore the powerful faction of senators who had murdered the dictator. A compromise was struck in the days leading up to the scheduled meeting of the Senate. Cicero, the brilliant orator and elder statesman who had supported the idea of the Republic's restoration, urged the Senate to avoid further bloodshed by granting an amnesty to the assassins. In exchange, the Senate voted to confirm all of Caesar's official acts, appointments, and laws, ensuring that his administrative framework and land distributions would remain entirely intact. Furthermore, Antony successfully insisted that Caesar be granted a full state funeral, complete with public honors and proper burial rites. This compromise seemed to satisfy both sides on paper, but it proved to be a fatal strategic miscalculation for the conspirators. They failed to realize that by allowing Caesar's laws and his official acts to stand, they preserved the entire legal machinery of his regime. And by granting him a public funeral, they handed Mark Antony a magnificent theatrical stage upon which to sway the emotions of the Roman public. The state funeral of Julius Caesar took place a few days later in the heart of the Roman Forum, an event that would fundamentally alter the course of Roman history and seal the doom of the Republic. A massive crowd of citizens, soldiers, foreigners, and plebeians gathered around the rostra, their hearts heavy with grief and anger. The funeral pyre had been constructed with extraordinary care, and upon it rested Caesar's wax effigy and his blood-stained toga, suspended so that the jagged rips and tears made by the conspirators' daggers were visible to all who looked upon it. As the solemn ceremonies began, Mark Antony stepped forward to deliver the funeral oration. Antony was a master of public speaking, gifted with a powerful voice, immense physical presence, and an uncanny ability to read and manipulate crowd emotions. Rather than delivering a dry, conventional eulogy, Antony chose to read aloud the decrees of the Senate that had heaped unprecedented honors, titles, and privileges upon Caesar, honors which the dictator had accepted with grace, but which his murderers had repaid with brutal betrayal. Antony then pointed dramatically to the wax effigy and the torn toga, recounting Caesar's many military victories, his boundless generosity to the Roman people, his clemency toward his enemies, and his love for the common citizens of Rome. With calculated theatricality, Antony lifted the tattered garment itself, displaying the actual holes where the blades had pierced the fabric, bringing the physical reality of the murder directly before the eyes of the grieving multitude. The emotional impact upon the crowd was instantaneous and overwhelming. A collective wave of fury, grief, and indignation swept through the forum. People began to weep openly, shouting out in anger against the conspirators. The tension reached a fever pitch when Antony unveiled Caesar's last will and testament to the public. As the reading revealed that Caesar had left a generous sum of money from his private estate to every single Roman citizen living in the city, alongside the permanent opening of his magnificent private gardens, along the banks of the Tiber River for public recreation. The mood of the crowd transformed from sorrow into an uncontrollable tempest of rage. The ordinary people of Rome could no longer contain their emotions. Crying out for justice and vengeance, the crowd improvised a massive funeral pyre on the spot within the sacred heart of the Forum, stacking benches, tables, voting booths, and wooden structures around Caesar's bier. Musicians, actors, and veterans threw their valuable robes, military decorations, and prized possessions into the blazing fire as offerings to their fallen leader. Armed with burning brands from the fire, enraged mobs surged through the streets of Rome, hunting down the properties of the conspirators and forcing Brutus, Cassius, and their allies to flee the city in absolute terror to save their lives. The days following the funeral made it abundantly clear that the old republic could never be resurrected. The political landscape of Rome fractured into hostile factions, with Mark Antony consolidating his power as the leading champion of Caesar's memory and legacy. However, Antony soon discovered that he would not rule unchallenged. Out of the political shadows stepped a young, unexpected contender for supreme power, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted son, who soon became known to history as Octavian. When Octavian learned of the assassination and his posthumous adoption in Caesar's will, he immediately traveled from Greece to Italy, despite the desperate warnings of his family and friends. To the astonishment of veteran politicians like Cicero, who initially dismissed the young man as an inexperienced youth easily manipulated, Octavian proved to be a political prodigy of astonishing ruthlessness and ambition. Arriving in Rome, he legally assumed the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus and immediately claimed his inheritance, using his own funds to pay out the financial bequests promised to Caesar's veterans and citizens. Octavian quickly won the fierce loyalty of Caesar's battle-hardened legions, who saw in the young man the living embodiment of their beloved general. Mark Antony initially viewed Octavian with condescension and distrust, refusing to hand over Caesar's estate funds and attempting to sideline the young rival. But as political tensions mounted and armed skirmishes broke out across Italy, Antony realized that Octavian commanded the absolute devotion of the veteran troops. Recognizing the necessity of uniting their forces against the common enemy represented by Brutus, Cassius, and the Republican senatorial armies gathering strength in the eastern provinces, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus eventually forged a formal political alliance known to history as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the secret First Triumvirate formed years earlier by Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this new alliance was an official, legally recognized dictatorship granted extraordinary autocratic powers by a terrified Senate and a cowed assembly. The triumvirs immediately instituted brutal proscriptions, hunting down their political enemies, confiscating vast estates, and executing hundreds of senators and wealthy equestrians to eliminate opposition and fill their empty war chests. The Republican faction, led by Brutus and Cassius, raised massive armies in Greece and Macedonia to contest the supremacy of the triumvirs, leading inevitably to the final, catastrophic civil war at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, where the Republican armies were utterly crushed and the leaders of the conspiracy perished by their own hands. Caesar's death did not restore the ancient liberties of the Roman Republic. Instead, it accelerated its complete destruction, sweeping away centuries of constitutional tradition and paving the unambiguous path toward absolute autocratic rule. The Republic died with him on the marble floor of the Curia of Pompey, and from its ashes rose the Roman Empire, an imperial superpower forged in the fire